Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and in this video we're going to be learning about optionals and unwrapping optionals in Swift. So I'll be discussing 4 techniques in this video. So without any further ado, let's get started. So I've fired up a Swift playground and I've imported Foundation since we do not need a UI kit for this demonstration. And before we get started with the 4 techniques, I want to create a prototype. So let's say that we'll create a function that will just take in a name and it'll print out that name. So let's call this func print name, and we're going to pass it one parameter, which is a name, and it's going to be an optional string. And all this function is going to do is it's going to print this name. So initially it just seems simple, but be careful about this question mark at the end of string here. This makes name the parameter, the local parameter for the function, as an optional. So let's create an optional property here. So we say var name is again, or we can call this var my name so that it's more clear. Again, this is another optional, and then I can call this function, so I can say print name, and then I can pass in my name. So it's gonna be happy since both these parameters are optional strings, but of course it's not gonna be able to print anything because there is no name. There is no name in my name, so it's gonna print nil. And so now we're gonna learn about how we can unwrap these optionals. So the first technique, which you should never use if possible, is force unwrapping, which is basically you confirming to the compiler that there is a value when you unwrap this optional. And because it's a force unwrapping, if there is no value when the compiler unwraps that variable, your application will crash. So to do a force unwrapping, all I'm going to do is I'm going to add an exclamation point to the end of the variable name, which means I'm telling the compiler now that there will be a value in this local variable name whenever you try to unwrap it. But since again, this is an optional and I haven't passed a value, it will crash the application. There we go. It says execution was uninterrupted because unexpectedly found nil when trying to unwrap an optional value. So that means in case by any sort of situation this value of name becomes a nil, then, and if you force unwrap it, it's going to crash your application. So that was the first one, which is force unwrapping. So the next technique we're going to learn is nil coalescing. How do you do nil coalescing? It's very simple. You just use 2 question marks. Now, what does nil coalescing actually do? It tells the compiler that in case you were unable to unwrap the value of name, you provide this default value. So I just call it a default value. So now the compiler is happy because this entire expression is no longer an optional. There is a default value to fall back on in case name fails. So since again we haven't passed any value inside my name, when I run this, it's going to print out this default value. There we go. So the next technique we're going to learn is called an if-let, and it is kind of what it sounds like. It says if you can create a value, then you print out something, else you don't do anything. So let's try that out. So if-let, the syntax is exactly if-let. So now you try to create a non-optional value from your optional value. So I can say if-let name unwrapped is equal to name. So I'm trying to say if you can create this non-optional value from this optional value, then you go inside this control block. So in this we can say print name unwrapped, because name unwrapped is no longer an optional. So I can, if I do name here, you can see this name is an optional string because exactly that's what we have passed into it, but name unwrapped is a non-optional string. So you know for sure if your control statement comes inside this if-let, then the value is a non-optional. But be sure to use the unwrapped value and not the optional value, again, then otherwise it wouldn't make sense. And you can also, because it's an if, you can also use an else statement. So in here you can say print name is nil, something like that, just to fall back upon. So again, since we do not have a value for name and we're calling this function with an optional, it's gonna go inside this statement and it's gonna say name is nil. But now if I try to give it a value, so again I have an optional string, but I give it a value called my name. Alright, there we go. And then if I call it, it's gonna enter inside this control block, which means it's going to print out the unwrapped value, which means it's going to print out my name. There we go. So the next technique and the last one that I want to show you is called guard-let, and this is one of the most powerful statements because it lets you escape a function early before it gets too late. So a guard-let is basically an if-let, but then it transfers the control out of your function block. So the statement for guard-let is this. So you say guard-let if you can create name unwrapped from name, then you do something else, you return. What this function basically does is it says if you can create a non-optional value called name unwrapped from name, if you can create this, great, then continue inside the function, else just escape out of the function immediately so that we don't create any more chaos. So now guardlet name unwrapped equals name means that only if it was able to create a non-optional will it enter or will it execute the lines after this. So let's say here, now we are pretty sure that if guardlet was able to successfully unwrap it, that's when we'll get this name unwrap value. So again, name unwrap, as you can see, let me just check that. Name unwrapped again here is just a string and it's not an optional, so you can have the peace of mind to know for sure that this is an non-optional. So again, since we have passed in a value which makes my name as non-optional, we can click this and then it'll just print out my name because it's happy because guardlet was able to successfully unwrap into a new variable called name unwrapped. But now again, if I remove this, that means guardlet will not be able to unwrap it, so it'll return out of the function because that's what we have asked it to do. So we're going to do this and it should print nothing because it never goes to the next print statement. So I'd like to provide you a tip here. Because guardlet is so dynamic and it's so cool, you might sometimes not realize that your value is not being unwrapped and why isn't your function being executed. And for that, I recommend that you do an assertion, which means if you just remove this return, you just type an assertion. So you can say assertion failure and then you can pass in a message. So in this message, it can be anything which is meaningful. So I can say that name value was an optional. So it's returning out of the function, returning out of the function. You can say this and then you can say return. So that means assertion is so powerful that it's only going to throw a fatal error when you're debugging and it will strip all that code when you've pushed it to production. So again, this is going to work like a normal guardlet. However, it's going to give you an assertion failure in case it wasn't able to unwrap the value of name. So let's try that out. Again, we have my name, which is an optional string, which doesn't have value. And then we're going to call this function. So it should hit assertion. So once it hits assertion, it says that name value was an optional, returning out of the function. So it hits this assertion. But now if we give it a value, so again, if I give it my name, and then if I call print name, it's going to be happy. Guardlet was able to successfully unwrap a name into name unwrapped. And then we come back into this print statement, we print my name out. So that's been it. Thank you so much for watching. If you guys liked this video and learned something about this dynamic Swift language, be sure to hit the like button down below. Thank you for watching this one and I'll see you soon in the next one.